I'm going to be talking about The Complete Stories of Oz by L. Frank Baum. So this is a massive book. How many pages is this? 1,486 pages. You can see it's a real door stopper here, containing 15 different stories by L. Frank Baum. Which you can see on the table of contents here. I have been reading this book over the past several months, and I've been reviewing each of these books separately because this is a compilation book. These books were all originally published as separate books and are still being sold now as separate books. So I thought I would review them as separate books. But the system I've established on this channel is when I'm doing a compilation book like this, which is several different books in one binding. I review each one separately, and then I do a final video kind of wrapping up the volume as a whole. So that's what we're doing today. If you want to see my individual reviews of each of these books, I'll put links in the description down below. You can click on that. But these are some final thoughts. I will be talking, I think, both about this specific edition, things like the cover art, the binding, etc., as well as making some comments on the content, talking about, the actual stories in here. And I'll try not to ramble on for too long. So I picked this book up several years ago now in Vietnam. In fact, I've still got the price tag on it. 300 Vietnamese dong, roughly about 15 bucks. A couple little points of interest here. Maybe these are some cheap shots, but it says The Complete Stories of Oz. And then down here it says Selected Stories. So that seems to be a little bit of a contradiction. We've got the standard back cover description, but interestingly enough, the back cover is just giving the plot synopsis to the first book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is only like the first 100 pages or slightly less. There's no indication anywhere from the publishers here that there's a much more developed universe of Oz than just the first book. And while I'm nitpicking oversights by the publishers, you see those slippers there? That is all wrong. So, if you know anything about the Oz series, you know that the ruby red slippers are the movie, but in the book, they are the silver slippers. I think silver is right. But yeah, the ruby red slippers are just the MGM version. So whoever illustrated this book, who is it? Cover illustration by Claire Rudock. Did not actually read the book. Just going off of the movie version here. Okay, those nitpicks aside, this you can see here. This is published by Wordsworth Edition. Now, Wordsworth, I don't recall. I was not really familiar with them too much before coming to Vietnam, but their editions of books were all over the bookstores in Vietnam, or at least they used to be. I've been in Vietnam here for so long, 7.5 years, that maybe it's changed now. I don't recall seeing them recently. But it used to be that the Wordsworth series of books were in Vietnam, and I became quite familiar with them because I'd bought a number of copies of Wordsworth classics. And they seemed to always go for the cheapest option. So it was always something in the public domain. It was always like if it was a book in foreign language, it would be whatever the oldest translation was in the public domain. There wouldn't be a lot of footnotes or publisher's introduction, and if there was, it would be. I think my edition of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn actually had footnotes, but the footnotes were completely useless. They footnoted everything you already knew, and anything that you didn't know there weren't any footnotes here. Not any good introductions. If there was an introduction, it was like an introduction already in the public domain. They seem to be very going for whatever the cheapest option was. And fair enough, cheap books have their price. I mean, this is in many ways a bargain, getting 15 books in one for 300 Vietnamese dong. You can see here it's falling apart, but I'm not sure if that's the book's fault. I've had this, been carrying this edition around with me for several years. I started reading this I think in 2015 or 2016. I bought this actually from a bookstore that no longer exists, since got shut down, went out of business or something. Tried reading it, initially got through kind of the first 4.5 books, then lost interest, then came back to it last year and said, right, I am going to finish this. So came through and read it. Did this as a buddy read with Dane Reeds, who's been reviewing all these books on his channel as well. But one thing to notice, and I'm not, this is probably maybe more to do with the binding more than anything else, maybe to do with the price as well. There are no illustrations in this book. So this is something to consider if you are considering buying this book. It's all text. And when I bought this at the bookstore, it didn't even cross my mind that the illustrations would be important. But then as I was reading these books and as I was doing my research on Wikipedia and kind of reading up on them, I became aware of how important the illustrations were to this series. I mean, when these books first came out, and they were children's books, the illustrator was getting as much credit as the author, and in terms of how these characters were conceived of in the public imagination, that went to the illustrator. The illustrator, I believe, changed as the books went on. But the illustrator to the first book, I think, kind of had co-writes to the characters, the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman, which, according to Wikipedia, he usually later used those rights to create his own comic strip in the newspapers based on those characters. There's a whole lot of interesting information on Wikipedia about kind of the history of the Oz series. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I remember from Wikipedia, actually, the review of the very first book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, a contemporary review, which apparently appeared in the Grand Rapids Herald, said, the story is okay, but I can't imagine anyone being able to make sense of this without the illustrations. And I saw that little snippet on Wikipedia, and I thought, I'm missing stuff because I'm not getting the illustrations. Now, the good news is all these books are in the public domain. So the illustrations are all online on Project Gutenberg. Now, Project Gutenberg, for whatever reason, probably because it's so old and goes back to the old days of the internet, seems to have two versions of each of these books. The older version doesn't have any pictures, and I'm guessing that's because maybe in the older days there wasn't the support for the illustrations. But then they also have a newer version, also on Project Gutenberg, which has all the original illustrations in color. Well, some of them in color. I think the way that they did these Oz stories is that there was a bunch of black and white illustrations, and then there were some color spreads. So anyways, it is all in Project Gutenberg. Make sure you click on the newer link rather than the older link when you're searching for these books. So what I did is once I realized that the illustrations were a big part of the reading experience, I would read the book here, and then I would go to the computer and click on Project Gutenberg and look at the pictures afterwards. I suppose a person might ask me, well, why not just read them off Project Gutenberg to begin with? And the answer is I'm old-fashioned. You know, I like a book I can hold in my hands. I don't like to stare at the computer screen too long. So I would use this book as my reading and then go to Project Gutenberg to catch up on the pictures. You know, there were some advantages in doing that. I mentioned that there was a contemporary review in the Grand Rapids Herald that said these books probably wouldn't make sense without the illustrations. But they actually, it makes sense. It's everything is described in very plain, simple English. And it was interesting to go and look at the illustrations after I had finished the book and be like, okay, yes, that is exactly what I thought it would be. And for the most part, the illustrations were exactly what I thought they would be. And in cases where they were different, it was just interesting to compare my mental picture with what the illustrations were. So yeah, that I guess that's one point to keep in mind. Another point to keep in mind is, as you can see, this book is a little bit huge and unwieldy. One of the reasons it took me so long to finish this is it's just not a good book to eat over lunch. I mean, you know, you can imagine trying to hold this book while reading a sandwich. It's just, yeah. I was really excited when I saw it, and I realized it was all the L. Frank Baum books in one binding. Because one of the things that had been, I've been curious about the Oz series for some time. But one of the things that prevented me from getting into it is I didn't want to be bothered with having to track down all the different books. But here, you don't have to track them all down. They are just all right here in one binding. Kind of. So I guess the thing to know about the Oz series is that there were 14 canonical books written by L. Frank Baum. And then after he died, the publishers wanted to keep the series going. It was really popular at the time. L. Frank Baum died in 1919. The last two books, The Magic of Oz and Glinda of Oz, were published posthumously. That's how you say it, right? Yeah, The Magic of Oz and Glinda of Oz. And then the publishers handed it off to different authors. I think there were like 4 authors in total. And they kept it going till the mid-60s when they had 40 canonical books, at which point they stopped the series. I don't know why they stopped it at that point. Maybe they had enough books in print to just earn money from the reprints at that point. And that was known as the famous 40, the 40 canonical Oz books. I think, according to Wikipedia, recently the publishers have started publishing more books. But for several decades, it was just known as the famous 40. So this when it says the complete stories of Oz, that's a little bit misleading. This is not all 40 Oz books. These are just the 14 books by L. Frank Baum. But, you might let that go because you might say, okay, well, L. Frank Baum was the original author. Everything after that was, just other authors. So I'm only going to consider the L. Frank Baum books to be the real Oz books. So this is the complete stories of Oz. Now, I mentioned that there were 14 books that L. Frank Baum wrote. But if you count these up, you actually will arrive at 15 books here, which confused me when I first bought this, because I knew from Wikipedia and whatnot that L. Frank Baum only wrote 14 books. But it turns out this book here, The Little Wizard Stories of Oz, is not considered one of the canonical Oz books. That's like a mini book that L. Frank Baum wrote to kind of gin up publicity before restarting his Oz series. And let's see if we flip over to that one, you can see it's one of the shorter versions. Now this is a series of very short stories. I think 6 of them. Now this is another case where we are lacking illustrations, because in the original book, it was lavishly illustrated. When I was doing this as a buddy reads with Dane Reads, he actually had a copy that was very nicely illustrated. I, of course, went to Project Gutenberg, as always, to see the illustrations I was missing out on after I did this. But there's a little bonus book here that's not part of the canonical series. So when I realized that there was a bonus book in here, I thought, oh, wow. Okay, I am getting the complete stories of L. Frank Baum, not just his canonical Oz stories, but a bonus book. But then once I actually started getting into this, and once I started doing my research on Wikipedia, I realized that this is nowhere near complete. So The Marvelous Land of Oz, there was a newspaper comic strip that L. Frank Baum spun off of that. There was also a competing newspaper comic strip about the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodsman, which his illustrator did. I guess they had some sort of argument over the rights. Also, after The Marvelous Land of Oz, there was a character in there called the Wogglebug, which L. Frank Baum spun out into his own book. Also, L. Frank Baum wrote a bunch of other stories about fairylands, and he tried to tie those together with Oz. For example, in The Road to Oz, we get cameo appearances from a bunch of other L. Frank Baum's other books. Then, after the Emerald City of Oz, L. Frank Baum tried to end the Oz series, and he picked up again with 2 other characters, Captain Bill and Trot. And he was going to make a new series about the land of the Sky Fairies. And I think his first Captain Bill and Trot book didn't have any Oz characters in it. But when that didn't sell very well, his second Captain Bill and Trot book had some of the Oz characters in there. Button Bright and I forget which other ones. And then when that still didn't sell well, then he restarted the Oz series. But in the Scarecrow of Oz, he integrates Captain Bill and Trot into the Oz series. So where was that? Scarecrow of Oz, yeah. So Scarecrow of Oz, 887. And you can see this all about Captain Bill and Trot. And in fact, it kind of starts off, if memory serves, as if the reader is already supposed to know who these characters were. And then from this book, they are integrated into the Oz stories, and then from here on out, Captain Bill and Trot are make regular. They live in the land of Oz, and so they're regular characters in the land of Oz. So, this is all stuff I discovered doing the Wikipedia research as I went. But you can see that if you really want the complete version, there are a whole bunch of tie-in books with Oz that L. Frank Baum wrote. Although, I suppose I can't really complain about it too much because the binding here is big enough as it is. I mean, already this book is enough of a doorstopper. Although I don't know, how big can bindings get? Could they have thrown more books in there? We're at 1,486. Could we go another couple hundred pages? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the content of these books. Excuse me. Yeah. I had a hard time forcing myself through this book. Starts off really well. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a classic. I mean, you kind of already know the story from the movie, although there are some interesting differences. Marvelous Land of Oz is a really good follow-up. Ozma of Oz is lots of fun. Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz is a trip. I mean, this is just... I feel like it was written on LSD or something. It's just really bizarre, but fun to read at the same time. Then The Road to Oz is where I started getting bored. And the Emerald City of Oz, I think The Road to Oz is where I stopped the first time. Emerald City of Oz is... Well, the Emerald City of Oz is where L. Frank Baum was getting bored himself because he decided to end the series here, and there's a little epilogue at the end. Where is it? Where he says, "Okay, kids, don't worry. How the story of Oz came to an end." So, the writer of these Oz stories has received a little note from Princess Dorothy of Oz, which, for a time, has made him feel rather disconcerted. The note was written on a broad white feather from a stork's wing, and it said, "You will never hear anything more about Oz, because we are now cut off forever from the rest of the world. But Toto and I will always love you and all the other children who love us. Dorothy Gale." This seemed to me too bad at first, for Oz is a very interesting fairyland. Still, we have no right to feel grieved, for we have had enough of the history of the Land of Oz to fill 6 storybooks. It's enough, kids. Leave me alone. And from its quaint people and their strange adventures, we have been able to learn many useful and amusing things. So good luck to Dorothy and her companions. May they live long in their invisible country and be happy. L. Frank Baum wanted to explore different stories, and he did. He was a prolific writer who even while his Oz stories were going on, he managed to crank out other side stories. But he never got another franchise off the ground. The Captain Bill and Trot stories did not succeed, and so then we go back to Oz with the Patchwork Girl of Oz. Little Wizard Stories of Oz, I think, was to drum up publicity for his returning to Oz. And then back with these books. Sorry, a point I should have made at the beginning, but perhaps it's not too late now. This is something that Dane has mentioned a few times over on his videos. The names of these books frequently have no connection to what's actually happening. So, TikTok of Oz really isn't about TikTok. Ozma of Oz isn't especially about Ozma. Uh, Scarecrow of Oz, Scarecrow's not really the main character in that one. Um, yeah, every once in a while, like the Tin Woodmen of Oz. Okay, fair enough. That one is actually mostly about the Tin Woodmen, among other things. But by and large, the titles are often misleading. Um, yeah, the plots of these books will often get repetitive. They are almost all journey stories. So characters are at point A on a map. They need to get to point B on the map because of something. So they travel along, and as they travel, they encounter many strange little kingdoms. Uh, and for the most part, it's pretty fun. The 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 quality or the fun of these kingdoms varies a bit from book to book. Sometimes I was bored, but quite often I thought it was good, whimsical fun. But there's very little tension in the actual plot. So if the land that they are visiting along the way is not particularly interesting or funny, then really the whole story begins to fall flat. Uh, these journey stories as well do tend to get a little bit repetitive and maybe boring along the way. Uh, the other thing which drove me crazy and I think irritated Dane a bit as well is the inconsistency or the continuity problems. Now, I don't know. Maybe I'm just too much of a nerd. I grew up, as a Star Trek nerd and as a comic book nerd, kind of both franchises which are famous for people obsessing over continuity. And, maybe that nerd culture was just not there in the early 1900s, which is when these books were coming out. I think the first one came out like 1900, and the last one was written in 1919 or something. Um, but yeah, L. Frank Baum will establish something in one book, and then he'll just completely go back and disregard it in the next book, to a point where, as a reader, you feel a little bit like your intelligence is being insulted. Like, no, 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 no. Don't tell me this. You already established in the last book that it was like this. Don't think I've forgotten. I came to accept after a while that the continuity in these books were very loose. It was kind of like I told myself it was like Looney Tunes, right? The characters are broadly the same with the same characteristics, but you can't expect what was established in one book to one cartoon to be carried over to the next cartoon. Except there are a number of books where even the continuity within the book starts to contradict itself. So I was willing to forgive the fact that the continuity between books was not good, but to have the continuity within a book contradict itself seemed to be sloppy. So the most obvious things, as L. Frank Baum is going through, he gets it some in his head somewhere along the way that Oz is going to be a utopia. And he seems to have felt this kind of obligation for his children readers to create kind of a safe and happy place for them to visit vicariously as they were reading. So there was no money in Oz. Everybody had all their needs provided for, and nobody ever died in Oz. Now, this was quite a contradiction from the earlier books. There is actually a very heavy body count in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Believe it or not, go ahead and read the book, and you'll see for yourself. But okay, it's then established later that nobody ever dies. Except you can't really have interesting stories in which there's no existential threat to the characters. There has to be something to drive the narrative tension. So L. Frank Baum will get around this by saying, okay, you can't die, but you can be buried underground by magic and trapped forever. You can be trapped, you can be cut into many little pieces, and you'll still be alive, but all those pieces will be scattered about. And then I thought, what are you doing here? I mean, why do this? You're making it worse than if you had just let people die in Oz. But the other maybe bigger problem is that he's just so inconsistent on this. People do die, or it's implied that people are in danger of dying, and it just seems to be forgetting that people are not able to die. The thing about the money is a little bit inconsistent as well, though that's not one of the major problems. Ozma is established as the ruler of Oz early in these books, but then all throughout the books it just doesn't make any sense because she's clearly not the ruler of anything outside of the Emerald City. I don't know why she keeps on insisting that she's the ruler of Oz, but every single Oz book, the characters journey out from the Emerald City and find all these strange lands that are completely not ruled by Ozma. It gets a little bit ridiculous after a while. Near the end, it's suddenly established that Ozma is a fairy princess, which is something that had not been established before. It's just all these inconsistencies and stuff like that have the potential to get on your nerves if you're the kind of reader who cares about these kind of things. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? Complaining about Ozma. So that's the danger of doing these things unscripted. There's one more. Oh, right. I think I remember now. That's all to the negative. Going into the positive, one of the interesting things about these books is even though the continuity is loose, there are frequent callbacks to earlier books, usually in the form of characters from earlier books reappearing. Quite often they just appear for cameos because L. Frank Baum can't think of anything for them to do. But I thought it was cool the way that the Oz world kept expanding and ever expanding and getting more and more citizens that we, the reader, were familiar with. L. Frank Baum was also good at giving each character a gimmick. I guess if you're critical, you could say that was a gimmick in place of a substitute for personality. But but I don't want to be critical. It works for what it is. So when you're introduced to the hungry tiger again, or when you're introduced to the glass cat, or when you're introduced to the patchwork girl, you don't have to say to yourself, "Oh, who was that again?" I mean, you know exactly who Jack Pumpkinhead is, or you know exactly who the Shaggy Man is. These are such memorable characters. I think nowadays this series is largely forgotten, except of course for the first book in the series. In fact, I realized that a little bit when I was trying to carry this book around with me. I had it with me at work for a while. And people were like, I didn't know there was a series of Oz books. I thought there was, people knew about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, but people had no idea there was a series. But back in its day, I think this series was very popular and these characters were very recognizable. And if you, I was reading the Martian Tales book by Ray Bradbury, and he made references to like the fairy Polychrome and the robot Tick-Tock from the Oz books. This was in one of the stories in the Martian Chronicles. Martian Chronicles, I think, was the name of the book. In which they were destroying the library, and was talking about all the characters from the literature there. And that book, well, when was that book written? The 50s and 60s, I think for previous generations, these characters were much more recognizable parts of pop culture than they are now in 2022. And that's another reason why it's interesting to go back and read these books for all their faults. And there are a lot of faults in here. I think I'll wrap it up here. I don't know if you can hear the baby crying in the other room or not. That's always a sign that I need to wrap stuff up. There's a lot more to say, but for more of my commentary, just see my individual reviews of these various books. And I'll finish up here.